You're listening to the Speaking Tongues podcast. I'm your host, El Charisse. Each week, I sit down to a conversation with multilinguals where we discuss and celebrate language, life, and culture through our own perspectives. Episode 73, Speaking Mandarin, Arabic, and Russian. Hello, language lovers. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Speaking Tongues, the podcast in conversation with multilinguals. My guest this week is Ernestine Lyons, a current councilwoman from Harper Woods, Michigan, host of Quick to Politic podcast, and founder of Linglobal, and we're talking about her languages of Mandarin, Arabic, and Russian. In this episode, Ernestine tells us how she was attracted to learning languages that are sometimes considered challenging for English speakers. We talk about her travel experiences, including her time studying abroad in China, South Africa, and in Russia. She tells us about learning Arabic and specifically the Egyptian dialect of the language and what she enjoys about speaking and practicing Arabic. We talk about the concept of being a global citizen and how her languages have enabled her to make connections not just around the world, but also in her diverse community here in the U.S. Ernestine and I also talk about the realities of traveling while Black and turning racist encounters abroad into teachable moments and learning experiences. Now, Ernestine is currently running for mayor of her town, and I hope you'll all join me in wishing her luck in her campaign. And let me remind you, wherever you are, please vote in your local elections so that you can work to make a difference in your local community. If you enjoyed this episode of Speaking Tongues, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the Speaking Tongues podcast on Apple Podcasts, or like and subscribe on YouTube so that other language lovers like ourselves can find the show. And if you've been a longtime listener of the show or even a recent listener, you can now support the show on buymeacoffee.com. Links to all platforms are in the show notes. Okay, let's chat. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking Tongues. I'm here today with Ernestine. I'm so happy to have you today on the show, Ernestine. How are you?
I am fantastic, and thank you so much for having me on the show. And I'm excited to talk languages.
Oh, me too. And it's always such a fabulous, wonderful time getting to talk to you. So I'm really happy that you had some time in your day to have this conversation. I like to start each episode with the same question, and that is, what is your first language and which languages have you learned to speak?
Wow. So I love languages. I have to say, like, my first language is English. I was born in the United States, and so my native language is English. And I was exposed to languages like Spanish and, just growing up in America where, the second highest population is, the Hispanic population where, in our second most spoken language in America is Spanish. So being exposed to it, but then my language loves then became the less commonly taught languages. And that's something that as a teenager, I started getting really fascinated with Arabic. And then that kind of morphed into other languages that were harder to find and, more, for some reason, they became these languages of strategic interest to the US government because I was in high school around the time that 9/11 happened. And so, but the languages are Arabic, Russian, Chinese, and then I'd kind of dabble with languages like Hindi and Turkish and Korean.
That's really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think it was at that time that led you to be interested in the less sought after languages and I guess all of your languages are UN languages pretty much. Well, most of them are.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I kind of started going down that path, and then I was just like, let me answer the question, and then I'll get back to, so around 9/11, is when I really got into languages because, September 11th happened and everybody was talking about, oh, well, these were terrorist attacks and, they were perpetrated by people who speak Arabic as a native language. And I really wanted to understand because there was a period where anything that was associated with the Middle East, with Muslims and with Islam and the Arabic language were associated with terrorism, and that was an unfortunate and dark part of America's history. During that time there was a lot of violence towards Muslims, and I wanted to be that person who sought to understand something that was really being vilified. And so I wanted to study Arabic. I wanted to understand this language. And right around that time, this was, 2001, 2, 3, 2002-ish. I was like 16. I started reading about critical need languages to national security and intelligence. And Arabic was one of them. So, a lot of, I think a lot of different State Department organizations and the Central Intelligence Agency. And, I was always interested in those organizations, and, always wanted to work for the FBI and all those kind of places, or for Foreign Service. And they were just saying like, hey, you get signing bonuses if you're really proficient at Arabic. And, then, there was so much need. We're just like, well, we need Arabic translators. And I was doing it from this sense of, I want to learn more about the Arabic language and Arab culture. And also, so I was trying to make friends because I wanted to understand a culture that was being vilified. But then it was also like, well, this could also be career advancement. And I looked at the list of critical need languages, or less commonly taught languages that are of strategic US national interest. And it was just like, you had Chinese on there, you had Korean on there, and there was also Russian. So I was just like, oh, these are all languages that I've had an interest in the culture. These are all languages that, to me, because they were challenging, I wanted to learn them. So, this was essentially for me an opportunity to, not only delve into some cultures that I was always curious about, but it was also like career advancement and opportunities for me to, experience all of this, because there were scholarships available, there were signing bonuses. And so it was appealing to me for a myriad of reasons.
That's smart. I wish I had thought of that when I was in college, like the scholarship thing too. Like it never even occurred to me to look at languages, especially Arabic. And it's funny because I 9/11 happened. I was in college. When I got out of college, I was looking for work, and there was like no work. And then someone told me like, um the State Department is hiring. So I went looking, State Department jobs, and like literally if you didn't speak Arabic, they were not even going to look at your resume. So I wanted to learn Arabic for that reason also, but then I was just really also drawn to the culture of it as well.
Right.
Um I didn't learn any Arabic at that time, spoiler alert. But next year I'll be getting back to it because I love Arabic so much. I
Oh,
want
I know,
to.
it's so beautiful. Like even the calligraphy that's everywhere, and yeah, that's just the most beautiful aspect of learning that language.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful language. I want to ask if you had any representations where you were growing up. Did you have any representations of these languages and cultures in your neighborhood, or maybe with classmates in your school or anything like that?
No, no, honestly, growing up, I grew up in Detroit. And so everybody around me, Detroit is a city that's predominantly African American. So everybody around me looked like me. Until I was about 11 years old. And then my family moved to the suburbs, right outside of Detroit. And I went from being, surrounded by other Black kids to being the only Black kids surrounded by, middle class, working class white kids who had Polish or Italian heritage. And, so, but they're all Americans. And so nothing was, foreign or, exotic. And I hate to use those terms. But everybody was just like a standard American kid who, was second or third generation, descendant of, immigrants. And so everybody was the same more or less. And, I thought of that as a very pivotal time because I'm like, oh my gosh, everybody's different from me. But then when you think about it in the American scheme of things, I went from everybody being the same to everybody still being the same. So like, and I always like say like be a global citizen, and the world is so vast. I just went from one aspect of our culture to the dominant aspect of our culture, and I just kind of felt like I got both sides of the experience, because there are a lot of African Americans who never get exposed to anybody that's different from them, and the same with white Americans, where you're never around any diversity. So that was my first taste of diversity,
Mhm.
and I felt like I kind of wanted to be the champion of people who were different, because I went from being surrounded by people who look like me to being the different one. And so whenever there was like a, new kid who was from India and had a heavy accent, I wanted to be, their friend, so that, we can be different together.
Mm.
So yeah, I think it's funny because like I didn't grow up exposed to anything that was different except having like an Indian friend in like
Right.
11th grade.
This is one of the reasons why I really love talking to you, aside from every other amazing reason to talk to you. But I love that you always come back to being a global citizen, and you always come back to how important that is for you, and how important it is for all of us really to embrace the whole world, because we're in this together. What does that, and maybe this is a like an obvious question, but what does global citizenry mean to you? What does it look like to you? Like, how does it feel, and how should we move forward thinking like this?
That's a great question, because, I think to me, global citizenry means cohesion. It means that we celebrate our differences, as opposed to, people always say America's a melting pot. So I think to mainstream America, that means you blend in, even though, you have a different nation of origin, or you have a last name that's harder to pronounce. You just pretty much ignore that identity and you embrace Americanism. And to me, it's more about being human first, and just kind of seeing the world for all of the richness that it contains. And it really, it's really fascinating exploring those differences and celebrating those differences. For a little bit back in the like 90s and 2000s, everybody's like, oh, we've reached the age of being colorblind. I'm like, no, you celebrate those things that make you different. I have a friend who before he identifies as a white guy, he's an Albanian guy.
Mhm.
And so, it's just like that is his identity. And if you take away his Albanian heritage, then, honestly, you take away him, you take away his whole personality, you take away that heritage, that everything he's so proud of. And, just being able to trace his lineage back and talk about the languages and the land that belonged to ancestors. And I think that's a big important aspect of what makes us global, is really caring about the person and the story. And I think I recently made a post about how currently the United States pulling out of Afghanistan is kind of creating this humanitarian crisis. And I think that we have to remember to be human first, and to care about humans deeply, and to be curious about other humans and their life conditions and what they're going through, what their struggles are, because in that you find more sameness, you find more commonality and less division. So to me, that's what global citizenship is.
I completely agree with you. And that is like the overarching theme of this show, and why I wanted to do a show like this, because, you know, we do have differences, but like you said, we're all human first. And I like you also grew up in a predominantly black neighborhood, and
Mhm,
I didn't really have friends who were not black until I was in high school. And I just
mhm,
remember being like so curious, even if they were, third generation this, or third, second generation that. And I just found those different points, I just found them so interesting. And I've always been just so curious about the world. And I want to learn from people who are different than I am. And I don't necessarily see the positives of just staying with, you know, people who experience everything the same way that you do. There's good in
right.
that, but there's also so much to be learned from the 7.5 billion people on this planet and all the different cultures that those people represent. I think it's really important. And I think if COVID taught us nothing, it's, again, we're in this together. We're all human and we all go through things just the same way, regardless of where we're from or what color our skin is. So
I mean, that's beautiful though, because really, when you think about it, it's like your life becomes enriched by what you're exposed to and being exposed to a different mindset. And, not just thinking like the sum of, the five people you spend the most time with, but honestly, you should be always trying to evolve, and I think that's just a life lesson in general, to seek people who do have a different understanding than you.
mhm.
Then maybe they, have a different educational level of attainment, or maybe they come from a different skill set, or it's just like they have a different religion or different understanding of what money means to people. And I think that diversity of thought and that diversity of like exposure, it really can enrich you, and it makes you less likely to kind of be upset about things, and you're more likely to be that person who can be the intermediary and resolve disputes and yeah, just see things through a different lens.
I agree. I totally agree. So let's talk about language. That's why we're here. So you mentioned Chinese, you mentioned Russian, you mentioned Arabic. Which one of those came first for you?
So I always tell the story this way. I pretty much started off with having, Spanish as this childhood friend who was familiar, because like everybody around you gets exposed to Spanish. And, it's just in America, you grow up, Spanish is the option if you're going to learn a language. And it was a familiar friend, childhood friend. And then as I got older, I, fell in love with Arabic. And, then I started cheating on Arabic with Chinese. And then, I fell in love with, the Russian language, and, kind of started having a little affair on the side there with Russian while I was having, the Chinese lessons and things. And then eventually from there, it was just like, oh, well, there's also Korean, or there's also, Turkish. And so, I think that my language loves then became, all right, well, I'm going to just like dip out a little bit here, and then I'm going to, try this one. But I did kind of, I started off with Arabic, then transitioned to, Chinese, because I ended up getting a scholarship to study abroad in China. And while I was in China, everybody around me, like who was, a fellow expat studying in the apartment complex I lived, most of my classmates were all like Russian speakers from various parts of the former Soviet Union.
Hmm.
And so I'm just like, oh my gosh, because my roommate was from Kazakhstan, this really handsome guy. And one of my language classes was from Russia, from like Moscow. And then one of my study partners was from Ukraine. So they all spoke Russian with each other. And I'm like, oh, I like Russian too. So yeah, that was I was trying to learn it while I was in China, but I'm like, let me focus on Chinese. And then when I get back to the States, I'm gonna take formal like Russian lessons. And
Okay.
then eventually ended up going to Russia.
Wow. Okay. How were those experiences learning Chinese here and then going to China and learning the language there? And I guess the same with Russia, with Russian and learning Russian, starting to dabble in Russian while you're in China, coming back here to learn Russian, and then having that experience of going and living in spending time in Russia.
It was really like all of those were eye-opening experiences, because the first time I ever left the country, I went to South Africa. And I think as an African American, it was the best ever leaving the country first travel experience to have, because I think you got reacquainted with what it means to be African in America, or a descendant from, African heritage, and what that meant to you. And, I think I became very, connected with my African heritage. I came back and took like Africana studies and really wanted to get more into that. So it just kind of, that was the travel bug that was bitten. And, my university offered languages like Arabic and Chinese. And so I was just like, oh my gosh, there's so many languages to learn. I don't know which one to pick, but I know that friends had done, various study abroad programs that were actually just, there were a plethora of China focused study abroad programs. And I think around that time, this was like circa 2008, 2006, there were so many programs that were focused on China because, everybody kept saying that, China's going to be the world's largest economy, and it eventually did become the world's largest economy. So there was a really big emphasis on study abroad programs for China. So they were easy to do. So China was, easy for me to find opportunities and scholarships and the visas and everything to be able to do that. So I'm like, all right, I just got back from South Africa and next I'm going to China. So it was just, and at that time, even it would have been because I started off learning Arabic, it seems like it would have been like, okay, well, the next logical progression would be to take your Arabic language skills and go to somewhere in the Middle East. But I think because of the conflict that was ongoing, in Iraq, and people kept seeing the Middle East as a place that was, unstable, and there were not a lot of opportunities for, folks to travel to the Middle East and to study languages. And they were, when you did find them, they were expensive. And, so China was an easy trip to find opportunities to do. And I didn't grow up rich. So I'm just like, I'm going to have an opportunity to get a scholarship and do this, other than because if I didn't get a scholarship, of course I wouldn't be doing it. So, because I'm just like, I got it like that, but, so yeah, it was, got scholarships and opportunities to travel to China, and I really enjoyed it there. It was, of course, I wrote an article about being Black in China because I was kind of seen as this object where, there was this, this Chinese perception of like, what does it mean to be American? And they would look at my American counterparts, like white girls who were, blonde and blue-eyed, or, that was their archetype and of like what is an American. And I even got in a debate in Chinese with a Chinese woman who refused to sell me dumplings because she was just like, 你是哪国人, which is like, well, what country person are you from? Literally, that's the translation. But she asked me and my friend this question, and I answered. I'm just like, we're American. And she points to my friend who was, white, long hair and all that. And she's just like, she's American. She's beautiful. You're from Africa because, you're, ugly and dark, and you have, and she used a new phrase that I had to later go look up. She says like, oh, 你有大屁股, and she kept making this like gesture, and I'm just like, what is a pigu? What is a da pigu? I knew da is like big something. She's like, yo, you have a big butt, and you're just, she kept saying that, and it was like, oh my gosh, wow, really? And she really didn't want to sell me dumplings. And it was just a really weird experience. But I had experiences like that all the time. But I mean, for the most part, I think people were curious. And I think younger people recognize that Americans come in all shades, especially because so many people were like, oh, Obama, 总统, President Obama. And they knew his story. They knew, what it meant to be African American because his story kind of became famous, and I think that was helpful, so that, this now the image of American was also Barack Obama, also his story. It was also, me. So I didn't have to try to break through that barrier with when it came to, being Black in China and living there as an expat. And then I experienced similar things in Russia. So, but that was essentially, yeah, that's the story.
It's one of those things where I'm like, well, listeners can't see my face, but I'm like shocked right now. But at the same time, I'm not shocked because we hear those kind of stories that happen to us when we travel. Like, what do you say when somebody says that
Right.
to
You
you?
can say like, all right, well, this can be a teachable moment. And I think in that same interaction with the woman who wouldn't sell me dumplings and told me, I was ugly, I was African. And I'm like, wait, why does African have to be ugly? Even if I was African, why is that how you think of African people?
That's not
But it,
okay.
it was like, I'm like, okay, fine, this is going to be a teachable moment. And I mentioned, Obama 总统他是美国人, it's like President Obama, he's an American person. And, so you pick and choose your battles. And, it just became the same. And it kind of heartened me too. Like, all right, I'm probably going to face this when I go to Russia. I'm probably going to face this when I
Mm,
go to Slovenia, to, Japan. And, so, but I think the more I travel, like this was in the 2000s and the early 2010s. And by the time I started getting into like 2019 travel, of course nobody was really doing those kind of things, and I think it was because of globalization, and people are just exposed to each other, and that's the thing about being a global citizen. You just know that there's diversity in the world, and nobody's going to look at you and just have those kind of negative perceptions like that.
hmm How do you think that your understanding of these languages, of Chinese, of Russian, how do you think that they granted you ease when you had to endure these situations or rude comments from people and just navigating those experiences? I noticed you responded to the woman in Chinese, and
Mhm.
I I'll say put myself in that position. If it were me, I wouldn't know what she said, number 1, but I
And
wouldn't know how to
that's
respond. So how does your knowledge of those languages, help you through those times?
For one, I make sure to learn what some of the lingo, is going to be in that country for derogatory terms and phrases towards, one, my ethnicity and gender, and, just knowing what you could potentially run into. And I think that that's kind of like even a protection mechanism for being Black in America too, where it's just like, all right, I know that not everybody's going to be my friend. And sometimes I'm wondering, I'm like, okay, what kind of microaggression am I going to face today? And, that's a sad reality that, I'm quite sure you can relate to. But, that was something that I think having the language and understanding the language set me up so that I knew that I was walking into a bad situation and probably want to leave, or probably not the best place for me. And, it kept me safe, and knowing what they were going to say in English. And it's like funny, even though the lady sold me dumplings, I didn't end up eating them because I'm just like, nah, this was like a super like weird experience. And
Right.
if I didn't know Chinese and I had only she didn't speak any English. And I think that a lot of the English speakers who were not proficient in Chinese, when they would interact with that particular market, they just point at things and then just kind of get what they needed, and then kind of like parrot a phrase like shishini, which every foreigner in China knows. And so I think it just kind of helped me to really understand what this interaction was going to be, and it helped me to prepare, like, okay, pick your battles. Am I going to battle this one? Am I going to try to find the words in Chinese to explain, to have a teachable moment with them, or am I just going to avoid the situation to just have a pleasant day?
Right.
So I think that having the language and even hearing some of that, because you walk around in China and sometimes somebody be like, oh, hey, and they just point and say, oh, Black person. And if I didn't know the language, I'd just kind of be like, oblivious, and, not realize I was potentially in danger, or not realize that, maybe something, nefarious could be happening, or,
Right.
just being prepared for it. So
Yeah.
I think that's definitely helpful.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I always This is something that I always want to talk more about because I also like to travel. I love to travel actually. But I do think that it's an important, thing to understand, and, especially as Black women as well who are traveling, and, you know, this is a way that knowing a language can help us get through different parts of the world and not just looking at it in the same way as our white counterparts may, just be able to get on a plane and go somewhere and take a trip. And, for us, there's a little bit of an extra layer to that. So I'm glad that we touched on that and we were able to talk about that a bit. And I am really sorry that you had those experiences.
Don't apologize, because I feel like those are character building experiences.
That's
And
true. That's true.
describing some of those experiences even got me like an offer to study at, University of Southern California. They were just like, we're prepared to offer you a scholarship. And I'm just
Wow.
eventually, because I just started a graduate program, I'm like, I turned it down, but I'm like, wow, that's amazing. So it made me want to keep telling these stories and keep, doing these kind of things, and, keep traveling and keep, trying to create global citizens through, the organization that, I run, that kind of focuses on the importance of learning a foreign language and getting people exposure to different cultures so that you can have those experiences yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Very important. It's really important. Talking about traveling through these countries, what were some of the things, I guess, culturally that you experienced or encountered that were very surprising to you? Or maybe things that, as you were learning the language in the States, either Chinese or Russian, and then once you got there on the ground and you're interacting, you're immersed, what were some things that stood out to you or surprised you that you had to navigate once you were there?
I can think of like extremely glaring examples, like linguistically, where I remember I was always taught in my Mandarin Chinese classes in the United States, or it's just like if somebody sneezes, you say, 100岁, it's like 100 years. And then you get to China and you sneeze and nobody says anything.
Mm,
It's just like there, because I think it's just because, you're trying to do apples to apples. And it's like you're teaching American kids who are steeped in Judeo-Christian values, that when somebody sneezes, you say, bless you. And, honestly, maybe years ago, people used to say "Yi shui" to just wish you health. But now, like, somebody sneezes, nobody says anything in China. Or other little things about, just shortcuts in language that you just pick up while you're there. Like for example, with Russian, I only ever learned to say "isho" as, still, but then I heard people started using it as like, more, like I'd like more water,
mm,
and so I'm just like, oh, okay, so you can really use these things in creative ways. But it really gets down to like, the more you use a language, the more you can kind of see the nuances. And it's so funny because one of my friends from Israel was just here, and it was just, and he was like, oh, I just learned a new word and I've never heard that word before, or how do you pronounce that word? And he's been speaking English like most of his life with his dad. His dad is American. And it's just like, well, but there's always some nuance. Like there'll be English words that I'll come across and I'm just like, oh, I've never heard of the word peripatetic or matriculate. And so you're going to be exposed to things spoken by people as they are. Even with Arabic, like people would hear me speak and they're like, you're speaking al-fusha, which is like scholarly speech. That's how you sound, like a textbook. And then people speak Alamiya, which is like colloquial speak, all over the Arab diaspora and all over the Arab speaking countries, and it varies from country to country. So I think that when you study a language, you're going to have to really be open to learning it in the country as like on the fly, because then you're going to pick up some of the fun aspects that you were not taught. And I think that's the most fun. That's the exciting part about learning languages.
yeah, definitely. Have you had an
Mhm.
opportunity to speak Arabic in an Arabic speaking country?
I have not. So I have not actually been to the Middle East yet. um there were a couple of opportunities where I'm like, all right, I'm going to Turkey. And so I wanted to learn Turkish. And so, I feel like that's the closest I came. But even though Turkish is not even related, it's not a Semitic language, it's
No.
nowhere near At a certain point before Ataturk changed the language in 1922. Turkish was written in the Perso-Arabic script, but of course then they changed that. So yeah, I've not had an opportunity. I do get a lot of opportunities because there's a large Arab population in the Metro Detroit area. So,
Oh,
I speak with
cool.
my friends. But no, I still need to make that happen.
When you were learning Arabic, I'm gonna assume, but you tell me, were you learning MSA, Modern Standard Arabic, or were you learning a dialect?
I started off learning Egyptian Arabic because took it formally at a community college where the professor lived in Egypt. And that was the dialect that he used, and that's what he taught. And he didn't teach from a textbook, even though there was a required text, which was Aleph Ba. But yeah, like we had that, but he taught us exactly what he was taught from his Egyptian teacher. So that was my first, kind of dialect that I was exposed to. And then a lot of my friends are either Yemeni or, Syrian or Lebanese. And so, you're hearing all kinds of different accents, and people are going to tell you like, nope, ours is the most pure accent. And this is like the closest to the language that was used in the Quran. This is what the original Arabic is meant to sound like. And of course everybody will say that about their version of Arabic. So but it's yeah, it's so many different aspects of the language. And I think that was maybe why I'm not as good at Arabic as I am with like Russian and Chinese, because yeah, there's dialects, but I think that teachers across the board are going to teach us the same. And, when you hear it, you're hearing one regional accent, so that, or just in my experience, that's kind of what was going on. I think I kept being exposed to so many different ways to say different things that it became like, all right, this is getting harder and harder.
And I think that's also, as far as practicing with Yemeni speakers and Syrian speakers, there are differences in the Gulf dialect, the Levantine dialect as well.
Yeah,
So I don't know if this is true, but I've heard that the Egyptian dialect is the one dialect that's like the a standard dialect. I mean, not like I mean, MSA is like the standard, right? But I heard somewhere that I guess when shows are dubbed into Arabic,
they're
um,
dubbed using Egyptian
that's
Arabic,
what
because
I
I think
heard.
that at a certain point it's kind of almost like how culture and language and TV shows and things, it was the Egyptian film industry that kind of dominated, what people watched and the music that they would listen to, and it was all coming out of Cairo. And kind of like how Hindi with Bollywood, it's kind of standardized things, and that's what it spread the culture. And I think that's kind of where that comes from,
Mm,
is the fact that the films and things were mostly like Egyptian films. And therefore that influence was what people were exposed to, because people wanted to watch the movies or listen to Arab singers who were from Egypt. So I think
yeah.
that's really the influence that I had.
Okay. I'm keeping this all in my memory for when I start learning Arabic next year.
Nice, nice.
Your languages, I guess your three, you know, Mandarin, Russian, and Arabic, they're all different.
Mhm.
And they all have different scripts, dialects, grammar rules, etc. How
Right.
did you, especially with Mandarin being tonal, and how did you navigate those three? What was your process for learning those three? And as you're still speaking them and communicating in these languages, like how are you able to keep them straight in your head?
Well, I think it's easier to keep them straight because none of them are related whatsoever. And
Hmm.
I think that is the thing that kind of made them each independently strong, is because there are no overlapping words. Like if you were studying French, Italian, and Spanish, you're going to mix those up a lot because they're all Romance languages. But if you study, Hungarian and Icelandic, you probably are going to mix those up too often because they're not related. So, and I think that was kind of the thing that was the challenge, is they all had unfamiliar scripts. And so when you're speaking Russian, you're in Russian mode. And when you see that Cyrillic, you're going to automatically think in that accent, and you're going to put that accent on. And I feel like it has happened every once in a while where I was speaking to somebody in Russian, and then all of a sudden I'll throw in a Chinese word or something. But it's almost like certain filler words were always easy for me to just kind of pull out, and it would be like in Chinese you have filler words where when you're saying like or and so those words are like 这个 so you'll just kind of like trail off and 就是这个东西是很漂亮的这个 and so you just kind of, so I would every once in a while kind of throw that into when I'm looking for a word in Russian. So it just kind of gets thrown out there. And so that's the only instance where you're going to maybe mix them up because they're completely unrelated. Of course, Russian is a Slavic language, and so of course it's going to be related to other languages like Ukrainian, and one of the other languages that I've been exposed to is Slovenian. So but yeah, it's really easy not to confuse them, or to kind of have a process and have a book specifically for your Russian declensions and your Russian nouns. And because there's gender in Russian. In the Russian language, you have all of these different cases, and then you have like dative, accusative, nominative, and all of these different things. And it has the most complicated grammar. But then with Chinese, the grammar doesn't have gender, doesn't have cases. And, it's really easy because you don't have plurals either, so of course, if you're talking about a male, woman, a non-binary person, a male, female, non-binary person, or a thing, then you just refer to it all as ta. So I feel like that's really progressive because but it also makes the language easy to learn because grammar isn't always everybody's strong suit. And I always joke that I'm not necessarily good at languages, but I'm good at making accents and remembering vocabulary words. So so then when you get into grammar and things, I think that's why Russian is more complicated, and so is Arabic, because there's so many rules, whereas Chinese was so much more fun. And I would just pick it up just because you didn't have to memorize dative, accusative, and what tense, and whether that was masculine or feminine, and the declensions and all of that. So and yeah, the noun of the verb and all of those kind of different things. So yeah.
Do you have any advice advice for someone who is, particularly Americans, who we know, learning a second language other than for maybe doing business or talking to like your fiance's parents or something? Do you have any advice for anyone who's maybe intimidated to learn a language that has a completely different script?
I mean, don't be intimidated. Just dive right in. And I think that, growing up, I was kind of always this little shy kid, and I was antisocial, according to my sister, because I would kind of just play with my brother on the playground and never talk to other kids, and was really shy. And I think language has made me the outgoing person who now runs for public office and who now, is really involved in the community and doesn't hesitate to jump into, leadership or to take on something new because, I was out there with these languages and not being afraid that I was going to butcher that word and, just know you're going to make mistakes and mistakes are how you learn, and it's just like, I will never forget how to say certain words. Like the dapigu, I'll never forget like how to say that now, because of the interaction that I had. Or, you'll have a really embarrassing experience where you'll never forget how to say, garlic in Russian, because, you ask somebody, you were trepidatious enough, you were courageous enough to, put yourself out there and, practice it as many times as possible. One of my favorite people in the polyglot community was the late Moses McCormick, because he would do this leveling up where he just randomly sees somebody speaking a language and he would just get all up in their business and try to speak to them in that language. He would ask them questions and people are not going to be like, oh my gosh, oh, you're speaking my language, get away from me. They're going to love it. They're going to love it. And then they're going to really appreciate the fact that you took the effort. And especially when you are, you're speaking a harder language or you're wanting to study a harder language with a different script or, with harder grammar. And, so people are really going to appreciate that. And you really have to give yourself patience. I used to get jealous of little kids I'd see, in the subway system in
Me
Japan,
too.
speaking Japanese perfectly. And I'm just like, you little brats, your Japanese is better than mine. But it's like, of course it is. And your English is better than theirs. So it's just, it's all in like a learning process. And, the same friend who is just here from Israel, we go to the Polyglot conference every year. And he was just saying like, yeah, I'm still studying, Romanian and, I'm at this level now and I just play it on Duolingo and, I get exposed to it and, I try to do this with it. And as opposed to me beating myself up because I stopped taking Korean and because I felt like, oh, well, it's hard to remember words or, I keep getting caught up on, how to say that and this grammar and I can't remember how to write that letter. And of course you're going to get frustrated. Stick with the frustration and keep going at it incrementally. And eventually you're going to get to that level where it's just like, oh my gosh, I am speaking this language. So that's my advice. Just stick with it. And that, if you a little bit at a time, you're going to eventually start to see that progress. It's like working out. You got to stretch those muscles. You got to, stick with it, even though you're sore the next day. You're going to have those brain melting moments when you have a 5-minute long conversation with somebody in your target language. So, but that is the exhilaration. And I still get palms sweaty and like an adrenaline rush and upset stomach every time I speak a language or just like heart pounding. And I'm like, but it's worth it every time.
I love that.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. You mentioned Russian and you mentioned the Russian word for garlic. Is there a story there?
Every day in Russia, I would force myself to have 5 conversations with 5 strangers. And, I would just randomly pick up things and be like, извините, пожалуйста, как называет это? And then just pick up something random. And I think that was the first thing I ever picked up in like a Russian supermarket. And I like to use garlic as a natural remedy. And I really wanted to go and find garlic because I wasn't feeling well. I had congestion or something. I know I'm like, oh, if I eat garlic, it's going to be perfect. I'm going to smell like bologna for days, but at the same time, I'm going to feel better. And so I was just like on a mission and I kept looking at the book and then trying to say the word. And then I think I was mispronouncing it. And then I went up to this little babushka and she's just like, oh, это чеснок, ты хорошо знает русский язык. I was like, you speak Russian so well, my goodness, yes, this is garlic. But I think she pronounced it right and I was pronouncing it wrong. And so yeah, it's really just kind of that was the challenge and that was the story.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I love those kind of moments where you're interacting with someone and you I've had moments like that myself where I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to make such a fool of myself and I don't know what I'm saying. And then, like you've said several times, it's a teachable moment. And there are words that I will never forget and phrases I will never forget, like in Italian, and things that I haven't even thought about for, oh my God, like over 15 years. And it's just like, I will, no matter how bad my language gets, like I'll never ever forget that. So I think those moments are really important. And that's what immersion's all about. Like that's what immersion is for. And actually being there and being able to pick up these things that otherwise you'd have to search a little harder in your brain to get the right word for it.
Right. And you definitely brought up good memories just now of like, there's a story that one of my Russian teachers told me while I was in Russia studying the language. He's just like, there was a secret weapon that teachers used to use when students would come to Russia. And, they'd be from all over the world and none of them, not one of them shared a language in common. But it was like the secret weapon was pretty much all of them being exposed, to each other and being able to survive with this, thrown into this immersion experience. You're in Russia and you're from, the Philippines, you're from Bangladesh, you're from Germany, and all of you are now together. And the only language you have in common is Russian. So you better believe it, to survive, you're going to learn that language. And that immersion experience is really important. But I think sometimes that expats make the mistake of relying on their English, hanging out with only people who speak, their language. And, after, I remember there were some American students who were in Russia at the same time I was, who they had been there for way longer. I think it was only there 3 months, and they had been there for like the entire summer. So it was like 6 months or something, and some from like May until September, that they were there. And the Russian wasn't improving. They weren't picking up on words, and they were just kind of hanging out with each other. So don't fall into the foreigner trap, where you, or even knowing British expats who have been living in China for 10 years, and they didn't speak a word of Chinese.
Wow.
And I'm just like, oh my gosh. And so because they would rely on their students, or they get girlfriends who were their translators. So I'm like, no, 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 no. That's a squandered opportunity. You need to. So yeah, don't fall into that foreigner trap, and use that secret weapon. Get that immersion experience.
I kind of I want to circle back to this, like being Black in America and being interested in other cultures. And I think that it's really, you mentioned growing up with this awareness, and you've told me before that your mother instilled an awareness and a desire to learn about the world. And I think that's really important. I think that I had an example of, the world through my grandmother, because my grandmother, once she retired, she traveled all over the place. She was in the Middle East, North Africa, she was in China, Japan, Hawaii, Europe, like she just Africa, like she went everywhere. And I think that when I was growing up, I didn't have anybody else's um I didn't know anybody else who had traveled or known anyone who had traveled to like 4 different continents, like, you know, and that was such a that was such a good example for me. And that really opened up like my world and what my understanding was. And I think that I personally think that it's really important, especially for the Black community and those of us in the Black community, to have these examples and to see how wide the world is and how much there is out there. What are your thoughts?
I do think that I also wanted to be exposed to, I wish I had been exposed earlier to, opportunities to travel the world, be around people who, my sister, I think, was one of the first people I ever knew to, leave the country, go off somewhere. And, she joined the Air Force, and, she was stationed in Japan. And that to me was the first time, travel abroad was a possibility. And I think we need more of that. So this is why I founded an organization, a nonprofit that's all about going into classrooms and exposing, little Black kids to the importance of learning a foreign language and having an international travel experience. And then also being exposed to new cultures that are in your own backyard so that you have a broader perspective, so that you understand, that there's a vast world out there, and then what you see before you isn't the only path forward. So I think it's really important to be able to be that example, because I wish I had more examples myself. I think I wouldn't have, made so many mistakes, or I would have known earlier what I need to do to be that person who works for the State Department, who works for the CIA, and how to get exposure to those kind of things earlier in life, as opposed to being 25. And then this is the first time you're exposed to, what the opportunities are for, working at, the State Department or whatever. So I think that the earlier you get exposed to it, the better, and the more opportunities you are to confidently navigate that space, being a person of color, when a lot of cases you're going to be the only one. You're going to be the only person in the room. You might be the only American. You might be the only person of color. You might be the only woman of color. And, so just knowing how to navigate those spaces where you are, the few, the only.
I want to be someone who, sets an example in the way that I had the example from my grandmother, and, seeing that this was possible. Like, I know people, I've grown up with people, and I know people now who they wouldn't even think of like leaving, let alone leaving New York City, but like leaving the country is just such a like a
completely out there concept. It's like, wow,
right.
you're brave. And not only did you leave the country, but you left for a year and you lived in a foreign country.
Yeah. I would love to find a way, and I love that you're working with students and with young people, but I would love to find a way also to just kind of introduce this way of moving through the world to, to our children, so that, they can see the potential. Because when I was growing up, I mean, we didn't even have like career options beyond like get a job, so it's
Right,
like,
right. So I mean, like that's the thing. Like sometimes there are just low expectations, and you don't get exposed to a lot of options. And so it's just like, oh, we'll just get a good job and stay close to home, and but then you kind of get exposed to something where it's just like, go off and see the world. And that's completely, beyond anybody in your circle can really fathom. So then they don't necessarily know how to be supportive. Where you're just almost like, well, why do you need to do that? That sounds dangerous.
right.
But, the more you kind of expose them, then I have a friend who like then eventually, his mother came to visit him in like one of his foreign country travel excursions. And, then she was just like, oh, well, I want to keep doing this. This is actually really fun. So yeah, and I think that's really important, because then other people around you will see you as the example, and they'll become just as intrepid as you are.
Right. Definitely. So tell me about the other languages that you are dabbling in, have dabbled in. You mentioned Korean. I believe you mentioned Hindi.
Yes, yes. I took Korean lessons, and then I found one of it's just like a Black owned foreign language company. And he was actually mentioned through like Black Girls Learn Languages. And he became my Korean teacher. And I don't know, I really felt like, wow, okay, another, Black Korean enthusiast. I want to learn from you. And he's just like really good. So shout out to Smarter Korean. But so yeah, I started learning that, and I was waking up at like 5 a.m. to learn Korean. And then I'm just like, oh my gosh, why am I doing this? Okay, I'm gonna stop with Korean, because sometimes with languages, they won't stick because you have to find a reason other than just like, it'd be nice to learn this.
Right.
There really has to be a compelling reason. You really have to be super interested in the culture, the language, and not to say that I wasn't interested, but I think it was like a lot of things going on. And so I think I've always had that problem with German too, where I would always try to learn it, and it was just like it never stuck.
Same. Exact
Mhm.
same. I tried
Right.
German last year and I said, why am I doing this?
Right, right. Why am I learning? It's nothing against the language itself, because I mean, I still picked up like entschuldigen Sie and yeah, sprechen ein bisschen Deutsch and just a little bit. And, then I saw like one of my friends, she passed this proficiency test in German. And I'm like, that could be me because we started studying at the same year. But it's like, all right, well, but there's some that I'm just like, okay, I'm going to Iceland, so I'm gonna learn Icelandic. And I have one phrase like ég skildi íslensku, which is like I speak Icelandic. And other ones were just based on like, okay, I'm going to Thailand, I'm going to learn some basic phrases, or I'm interested in Bollywood movies, so I'm going to learn some basic Hindi. So I think that's really what it was, for me, is either I'm going to travel there, or just be a cool language to learn. And it's just like, oh, you learn the phrase and you're going to stick with it. I had one of my linguistics professors tell me like, oh, picks up languages like she picks up stray puppies, and they're just like, she's gonna take them home with her, and then, you know, um, cultivate them and keep them, and maybe move on to another interest, which sounds bad. But yeah, those are some of my language loves. I actually was really into Turkish because I was dating a Turkish person, and then as soon as we broke up, I'm like, I'm done with this language. So it was just like, oh, that was wrong. That was wrong for you to do that poor language. Um,
If
but
if
yeah.
there was one of those languages that you had to pick up tomorrow and run with it, do you have one in mind that you would love to revisit?
Well, I spent all the beginning of this year, like during Black History Month, I picked up, like I was just like either reacquainting myself with an African language like Hausa or Zulu or Swahili. I think I would pick one of those,
Okay.
and pick up and just run with it, because Swahili was a lot more fun than I realized. And people were just like, wow, we love this language series. So I kept looking for African languages to learn. And I was just like so excited to be learning these languages, and then kind of teaching people little known facts. And the language videos got longer and longer. It started off like February 1st. It's like, here's a phrase, and then it became a whole also like like a paragraph that tells you about the history. And then it got into like, this is Setswana, and you know and this is another language that Umuro, I've never heard of this one, and like, let me tell you more about this. So but yeah, I think it would be some maybe of the smaller indigenous languages. I would pick one of those because I really did have fun with that series, and I'll probably do it again just because it was
Please
really
do it
fun.
again. Please do it
Oh
again.
my
I love
gosh.
that series so like I every day I was waiting to find out
Oh,
language you
everybody
were
was.
gonna
They loved it. And so I swear, like some of those videos were the most views I have on any of my YouTube videos. I think was the Somali videos. They were super popular.
Hmm.
Um, and so yeah, I kept telling myself, I'm like, okay, well, you know what, when so and so month rolls around, like you're gonna do Polish, or you're gonna do like for Asian American History Month, you're gonna do like Chinese phrases. And I'm like, I'm too busy for that. No, I cannot.
You have a lot going on, and that actually brings me to my next question. And I just want to say one more time, please do that series again because it was amazing and I loved it.
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure. It's gonna be the thing like now every year,
I love it.
probably.
Tell us about some of your platforms that you have. I know you also podcast and you have a YouTube channel and you talk to other multilingual people. Tell us about that. And if you'd like, I'd love it, but if you'd like, tell us about your mayoral campaign.
Well, so you can actually go to ernestinelyons.com. You can go to linglobal.org. Linglobal is my sort of organization that focuses on the importance of learning a foreign language and having those international experiences. And, that's where you can find things like my videos where learn an African phrase in it's just a myriad of different languages. My YouTube channel is Ernestine Lyons. Just, type in Ernestine Lyons, Lyons, and you'll see all sorts of content that ranges from political to foreign languages to interviews with interesting people, and then different community initiatives that you can be involved in that range from environmentalism to community policing to small business. So that those are ways you can find me. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. So yeah, you can follow Linglobal as well. And yeah, my podcast is Quick to Politic, and with that we talk about history, politics, internationalism, and the world. So we are taking a little hiatus. We went off the air for a break for 2021 back in May, and we will be back in January. So I'm really looking forward to that. If not, we're probably going to be back in a format that is truly quick to politic, because I swear the show ends up being like 30 minutes. But we're just going to come back in quicker snippets. So, and at ernestinelyons.com, to answer your last question, you will find a lot more. This is the official website of Ernestine Lyons for Mayor. And I have been really active in my community, and I'm the youngest person who's involved and on city council.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people have been just like, hey, you're 35 and, you're really out there, you're a go-getter, and we really like what you're doing. So, when are you going to run for mayor? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not running for mayor. I'm not running for mayor. And then finally, with enough, community support, people are just like, you're our next mayor. I'm like, you know what? Okay, I'm leaning into it. I am running for mayor. And people were like, yes, yes. And so I have always run on a platform of, incentivizing doing business in my particular city, which is the little town of Harper Woods, which is right next to Detroit. We share, two sides of Detroit and then other little suburban communities. We're 2.6 square miles and population just went over 15,000. So we're a small little town. And we I think we can definitely use some innovation when it comes to bringing creative projects to the city. And so that's why I'm really willing to give it my all to bring some innovative new ideas to the city and to really fight for keeping jobs here and supporting entrepreneurship, supporting small businesses, and just really getting people exposed to different ways of thinking about things. So that's why I'm running for mayor, and so vote for Ernestine Lyons on November 2nd.
Vote for Ernestine Lyons on November 2nd. I second that. And I wish I could vote for you, because you would 100% have my vote. I think that you are just amazing, fantastic. And I've said this 4 times already, but I absolutely love chatting with you. I feel like we have so much in common, from like our upbringing to like the way we see things and understand things. And it's just always such a pleasure for me to talk to someone who gets it.
You're same here, because I think we came across each other and it was just like happenstance, and I started following you and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm amazed, and I love hearing your interviews. So yeah, we're kindred souls, and we definitely got to keep up with each other and support each other. And this has been a crazy whirlwind year for me, but we've had some collabs, and you can definitely see more content coming out from me. I know we've had calls on a lot of different things. So thank you so much for having me on, and for just always being that sunshine and inspiration.
Thank you so much. And for those of you listening, I will add Ernestine's links into the show notes so that you can click the link and find her right away. I want to say thank you again for this conversation. I've had a blast talking to you and learning more about your language background. I like to end each episode with the same question, and that is, do you have any jokes, tongue
Oh,
twisters,
God.
cool slang words, idioms, words of wisdom, or words of advice in Mandarin, Russian, or Arabic to share?
Ooh, let me think of a good one. Ah, okay, wait. Okay, this one is completely random, but I still say it every time, so like it's almost like um 说早早就到. And it's speaking of General so and so. General so and so just showed up. So anytime like I'm talking about somebody and then they kind of like pull up or something, I still say it. And then my people around me now, are just like, what are you saying? What are you? And I think like my true friends recognize I'm an eccentric and they just expect me to be randomly saying something in Chinese. So it's that's one of my things. 说早早就到. And I still say it. And that's kind of like one of it's a chengyu or like certain I want to say 5-syllable phrases that kind of have a story behind them, and you learn these and then they kind of mean something else. And
So I do this for every question most of the time. It depends on what the person's answer is, because sometimes someone will give me something very poetic and lengthy, and I don't want to take up all of their time. But this is short enough. And
Mhm.
I usually ask my guests to please teach it to me so that I can try. I can try something new.
Oh, okay, all right. So it's just Sao, Cao, like said a million times. You say it so many times. It's so funny. Yep, Cao Cao was a warlord during the Han Dynasty. So essentially, it's really like speak of the devil. That would be the English equivalent. It's just like, oh, you just popped up. So, all right, I'm going to teach it to you.
Okay.
说说
Swo,
uh-huh 早
sao, sao,
早
sao,
so you're saying three different things. You're saying 说早早
swo, sao, sao, sao. No, I screwed it up because forget that it's tonal. Wait, okay. Let's
Mhm.
okay. One more time. I'm
All
gonna
right.
focus.
说早早
Sh-
说早早
Shuo, sao, sao,
早早到
sao, sao, dao.
mm-hmm. I said 就到, just like just arrived, but right here we'll just keep it simple. It's just like speaking of South just arrived, or
Okay.
South arrived. So yeah, because sometimes people will say 说就到, but this is just 说早到
Sao, sao, dao. Okay.
Mhm. So 说早
Shuo, sao, sao. Sao,
早
sao,
到
dao.
right. You did a really good job. All right.
I have
Love it.
to it's so funny because I'm always like when I question myself and I'm like, huh? I'm like, wait. It's a tonal language. I probably like said something terrible.
I feel like I still don't get the tones exactly right. And, but it's gotten to the point where I think people recognize you're a foreigner, you're trying, and you will, eventually start to hear that tone doesn't sound right,
Right.
especially in the context. And, just like speaking of context, there's Beijing, which is the country, or not the country, the city. And then there's Beijing, which is background or context. So there's a
Oh.
different Beijing, like background, context, and then there's also like the name of the city. So and those tones matter, and I'm quite sure I butchered both of them just now. So, but put me into a situation where I just get used to speaking Chinese, or I've been speaking it for, like an hour or so, then I'll just recognize like, nope,
Right.
that doesn't sound right. You'll
Yep.
self-correct.
Right.
So yeah, yeah, I'd say just do it. Just plunge right in.
Thank you so much again for this conversation. And as I said, it was truly, truly a pleasure to have this time with you. Before I let you go, do not think about this too hard. Any language of any language that you've even touched or that you've had a whole conversation in. After we've been having this great conversation for all this time, in any of those languages, what is the first one that comes to your mind? What is the best way to say goodbye?
Ma'asalama.
Ma'asalama, Ernestine.
All right.
Thank you so much again, and I'll be talking to you soon.
All
Bye.
right. Thanks so much for having me.